Good afternoon and welcome to today's Know Your Rights information session. This webinar is brought to you today by Their Story is Our Story and their affiliate, the Refugee Physicians Advocacy Coalition, or RPA. My name is Brandy Kilmer and I'm the Senior Director of the RPA Coalition. We thank you all for being here today to take part in this discussion. Recent changes in U.S. immigration policies and actions have left many in the refugee community feeling uncertain about the security of their immigration status and wondering how to protect themselves and their families. We want to address some of those concerns in this information session. Just a few housekeeping details before we begin. We have enabled the translated caption setting in this Zoom presentation. If you wish to use this feature, simply click on the Show Captions icon or the CC in the control bar at the bottom of your screen and select your preferred language. You may have to click on More and then Captions. I'll give you a moment to find that. Today's presentation is being recorded so that it can be shared with community members, but we will turn the recording off during the question and answer period at the end. If you are concerned about your privacy, we suggest you change your name. You can do that by hovering your mouse over your name, then clicking the three dots in the upper right corner of your profile and click Rename. A pop-up box will appear where you can change your name to an alias. Please keep yourselves muted during the presentation. If you wish to ask a question, you can type your question in the chat anytime during the presentation, and we will address it at the end. Or if you prefer, we'll give you a chance to come off mute and ask your questions once the recording is stopped at the end of the presentation. And now I'd like to introduce our guest presenter, Professor Emily Chertoff. She is an associate professor of law at Georgetown Law School. Her research focuses on transformations in the administration of law enforcement, particularly immigration enforcement. Before joining the Academy, she served as the first executive director of the New Jersey Consortium for Immigrant Children and Advocacy Coalition that won state-funded legal services for immigrant youth. She also was a staff attorney and Yale Public Interest Fellow at Immigrant Defenders Law Center, where she helped build and impact litigation and appellate advocacy practice. Her work included emergency COVID-19 habeas practice, Ninth Circuit litigation, and direct representation of detained people. At Georgetown Law, Professor Chertoff leads the Immigrant Experience Project, a new research initiative that explores how different groups of people with immigrant status understand, respond, and adapt to recent changes in U.S. immigrant law and policy. Professor Chertoff, thank you for taking the time to share your expertise with us on this important topic. I'll turn the time over to you now.
Thank you. Thank you all for attending. It's great to be here. I wish we were here under happier circumstances, but I'm happy to be able to share this information with all of you, answer questions at the end. Brandy gave a nice introduction talking about my background, but in addition to being a researcher, I do have a background in immigrant defense. And it's more in that capacity, both having run an organization and having done that kind of work, that I'm talking to you today. So I am going to share a quick PowerPoint. Can everyone see that? All right, so we'll be using this to go through the presentation today. I will give you a little bit of an overview of what we're going to cover. And I will start out this presentation by saying that I'm going to be talking a lot about things that you as individuals can do in order to protect yourselves and your loved ones. So I will talk a little bit about legal processes, legal representation, but there's a lot that you can do for yourself, for your loved ones, for people who you care about and your friends in order to keep yourselves safe. I will share a little bit of information at the end on legal resources. I'll probably do some of that when the recording is off. It's worth keeping in mind, though, that legal services providers right now are really stretched. So anything that we all can do as community members, as individuals, in order to protect ourselves is helpful at this point. So I'm going to start out just kind of setting the table by talking a little bit about what is currently happening with immigration enforcement in our area. I know that a lot of you are probably sharing information about this regularly with people who you are friends with, people in your community. So some of this stuff may be familiar to you, but I've also found it can be helpful for people to get a bit of a bird's eye view of what's happening, because there's been so much discussion about immigration enforcement in the media and a lot of rumors candidly going around. So it's helpful to think about what's happening, what's not, what can we expect. We'll talk a little bit about sort of the ordinary procedure if you are arrested by ICE, by which you might be put into immigration proceedings, into deportation proceedings, as well as some things that have been a little bit different in some parts of the country, just so that you're aware of those things. We'll then talk about some basic advice for your safety and your well-being interacting with ICE in different settings. And we'll talk a little bit, this can vary hugely across different people, in terms of options for contesting detention and deportation if that happens to you. And I'll share some resources at the end when we're no longer recording in case those are helpful for folks.
And
okay.
Emily, sorry, before you go on, can you just, some people may not know what ICE stands for. Could you explain that?
Sure. So ICE is Immigration and Customs Enforcement. That is the agency that does immigration policing, immigration arrests inside the United States. One thing that it is important to know, though, and if you're in the DC area, you may be aware of this, there are other agencies now that are also involved in immigration enforcement. So in some jurisdictions, police work with ICE on immigration enforcement. And also, if you're in the DC area, you may have seen that there are Customs and Border Protection officers and other law enforcement officers lately who have been involved in enforcement. So I'll talk about that a little bit later, just for you to be aware, though, that sometimes someone will not necessarily identify themselves as ICE, but you still have to be concerned about interacting with that official. So we'll discuss that. Okay, so before we get started, I just want to talk a little bit about what's happening with enforcement. And I want us to kind of think about separating out a few different issues. There are stories that you all have no doubt heard about things that are happening at the national level or in certain cities. Those things may not be happening in our area, right? So we want to think about what's happening locally. We also want to distinguish what's happening to people with different immigration statuses, because that can help us assess our own risk level, right? So all of us have heard there have been stories, of people with green cards being put into proceedings recently. Stories like that, obviously really scary, but also relatively rare, right? So we want to think a little bit about different risk levels for people with different immigration statuses. And we also just want to keep in mind that some things may be happening often in our area or commonly, and some things may be really rare. And I just want to talk about this because my perception has been that there's a really high level of fear in a lot of communities. And obviously that is justified because we have seen a lot of changes. But I also want to be sure that we're being realistic about what are the biggest risks, what are lesser risks, and how might those change over time. Okay, so nationally, I won't spend time on this, but you all have probably heard about some of these developments. ICE arresting people at immigration court. There's been images coming out of New York City that have been really scary of masked ICE agents arresting people, arrests at schools, other sensitive locations, and then obviously stories that have been in the national media about visa holders being turned away at the border, green card holders being detained. So some of these things have happened locally. Like we'll talk a little bit about what I've been able to find out about ICE arrests in court in Virginia, but other things have not really happened locally or have only happened to a few people. So again, just kind of like keeping that in mind as we set the panorama of what's going on here. So what is happening locally in our area now versus a few months ago? One thing we can say is that there has been more immigration enforcement in the suburbs, especially in Virginia. Okay, so if you're a person who lives in Virginia, this is something that you may be aware of, you may be talking to friends, family members about, and I want to confirm and validate that that is in fact statistically right, that we are seeing more enforcement. So there's been an increase in ICE arrests in Virginia, Maryland, and DC. It is worth keeping in mind that the number of people we're seeing arrested so far has gone up, but it's still only affecting a fraction of the population who could be subject to immigration enforcement in this area, right? So to take the example of Maryland, the enforcement rate has gone up a lot in Maryland. There are about 500,000 non-citizens in Maryland, 11 people being arrested per day on average over the past few months. If you look at the total number, even if we assume this continues for the 4 years of this administration, we're talking about something like 3% of the population potentially being arrested by ICE, and not all of those people will be deported. Again, that's really high for those people who are affected and their loved ones. It's a serious problem, but I also just want to kind of level set that we're not talking about a situation, at least right now, where everybody has to worry that when they leave their house, they're potentially going to be arrested by ICE. I will say to you, this pace may change. So some of you may be aware that the government has appropriated new funding in the federal budget for ICE and for immigration detention. And so it is possible that this will change over time. But I'm presenting these statistics so we can have a realistic view of what's been happening recently, just keeping in mind that this may change as we see new resources come online. Another thing to be aware of is that there's some differences in what's happening in different states in our area. So again, folks in Virginia may have personal lived experience with this, but we have seen the Virginia state government collaborating with ICE and with the Department of Homeland Security, which does immigration enforcement, in order to kind of share resources and share information. So you may be aware that the governor has used the National Guard for immigration enforcement. He's kind of pushed local police to collaborate. One thing that this means is that particularly if you're in Virginia and you're interacting with the police, you should be attentive to the possibility that even if they're local police, it is possible that they will share information with immigration and customs enforcement. And so that's true in any jurisdiction, but in Virginia, it's a particular concern, whereas in DC and Maryland, that does not happen as a routine matter. So something to keep in mind. You also probably have heard that in the past few days, for those of us living in DC, there has been more federal law enforcement in the city. Anecdotally, there seems to be a little more immigration enforcement happening also in our area than there has been in recent days. I have heard from people who have been in touch with the DC Police Department that it's not clear that there's like a really profound commitment to continuing this enforcement effort beyond the 30-day period that the president has talked about. So I don't know that we should expect this to continue, but I, again, want to mention that this is something that may affect enforcement patterns over the coming weeks. And finally, there are some things that we've heard about happening nationally that we know are happening in our area too, right? So there have been reports of ICE activity at courthouses in Virginia. There's been reports of ICE activity at immigration court, so people who are going in for their immigration hearings in Fairfax, Sterling, potentially other places. And then also at just regular court, like traffic court, municipal court in Henrico County and Chesterfield County. I personally have not heard reports of enforcement at courthouses in DC or Maryland in the past few months. Again, that doesn't mean that it's not going to change, but just acknowledging that there are some differences in different jurisdictions and what is happening in that context. So why am I telling you this? Obviously, it's a little stressful and scary to hear these things, but I think that as you think about how do I keep myself safe, how do I keep my loved ones safe, and what do I need to worry about, it is worth thinking about your risk profile and being realistic about what your risks are and maybe like ways in which you are not at a high risk. So I think this administration has two goals, and this is based on what they've said about their policies, as well as what we've kind of seen with enforcement patterns. I think they want to keep overall deportation numbers as high as they can, which means going after people who it's going to be relatively easy for them to go after. They don't want to expend a lot of resources. And I think they've also used a select group of cases, maybe with people who like seem like they have a more secure status or they wouldn't otherwise be at risk, in order to attract media attention and intimidate people. So this is a particular enforcement strategy, and it means that not everybody is going to be equally at risk of enforcement. Unfortunately, if you are undocumented, you are still going to be in the highest risk group, regardless of the changes that have happened, because it is just going to be easiest for them to deport you. Conversely, if you have a relatively secure status and up till now have felt like, I don't feel like I'm at much risk of enforcement, it may be that there will be more enforcement against people who have your status, but you don't necessarily need to worry like every time I step out of my house, I'm at risk. I know this isn't typically what lawyers say. Usually we present all of the risks, but I think that it's worth, given the levels of fear in a lot of communities that I'm aware of, just being candid about what we are and aren't seeing at this point, as well as ways that that might change. Okay, so just to give an overview, I'm going to talk a little bit now about what happens if you're arrested by ICE. Okay, so that's obviously the thing that a lot of people are worried about. They're arrested by ICE or they're arrested by another agency that's collaborating with law enforcement and they're with ICE enforcement, and they're put into immigration proceedings. So again, we'll talk a little bit about the norm, and the norm is still what's happening to most people. So most people, if they face this problem, it's going to look like what I'm about to talk about. And then we'll talk about a couple of trends that have been outside the norm. So this is a normal deportation procedure. I will go through it step by step. But basically, there are two ways that you could wind up having a problem with immigration enforcement. It obviously gets a lot more complicated than this, but this is sort of the most basic way to explain it. So the first step is that ICE finds a person who may be deportable. This is a lot more complicated than what I've written here, but there's two basic situations in which that happens. So if you are undocumented, you don't have any legal status in the United States. Unfortunately, if ICE encounters you and they decide to put you in proceedings, the fact that you are undocumented alone makes you prima facie deportable like as just a matter of law. It doesn't mean that you can't fight deportation and that you might be able to stay in the United States, and we'll talk about that. But it just means that at the outset, you're in a category of people who can be deported. The second group of people are people who have a status. So this can be people who have visas, who've been granted asylum, people who have a green card, but who are accused usually of some kind of crime or infraction that means that the government can take away that status. So those are the two categories. Now, how does ICE find people who may be deportable? You're probably aware of some of the ways, right? But there's been ICE patrols in certain neighborhoods. ICE can do raids. They can come to workplaces. They also get information very frequently from local law enforcement. So again, we talked about the ways that Virginia and Virginia police in some jurisdictions, not everywhere in Virginia, but in some jurisdictions, are collaborating with ICE and with immigration enforcement. So in those situations, law enforcement may pass on details of someone's information to ICE if they've been arrested or had contact with law enforcement. They may even, if they have that person in jail or are detaining them for a criminal reason, actually pass that information to ICE, and ICE can go and detain that person when they get out of jail. So there are different ways that ICE finds people, but those are the two situations in which you may become deportable from the United States. So then there's like another kind of fork in the road. ICE can put you into detention while it is trying to deport you and you're doing your immigration case, or it cannot. So in the past, it was much more common, and even during the Biden administration, actually, that even when people were in deportation proceedings, ICE might say to them, you know, you have to wear an ankle monitor or you have to go to check-ins, but it didn't necessarily put you in detention unless you were in certain categories or certain groups, which we won't get into. Usually it has to do with criminal record, although not always. In practice now, and we saw this also during the first Trump administration, ICE does seem to be detaining more people who it arrests. So there is a higher likelihood that if you are put into proceedings, you will be detained, at least initially, while that's going on. And part of the reason that they're trying to build more immigration detention capacity across the United States is unfortunately so that they can do that to more people. Now, just because you are detained at the outset of your immigration case does not mean that you will be detained the entire time. So typically, and it varies a little bit based on the jurisdiction, but typically people have the opportunity to ask for what's called a bond hearing, which means an opportunity to go in front of an immigration judge and say, here's why you should let me out. I shouldn't be in detention. I don't need to be in detention. There are different legal factors that the judge will look at to evaluate this, but the basic things that they'll want evidence about are danger to the community, which unfortunately sometimes they are pretty broad about what constitutes danger. And they'll also look at the risk that you're going to not show up for your hearings. Some people who get put into detention get bonded out and they are able to do their case in a non-detained immigration court. That means they can live at home, you're with your family, you're able to kind of go about your day-to-day life. You may have to do check-ins. Your deportation case is going on. You go to court and you get kind of what is standard due process in an immigration hearing, which unfortunately is not as good as what you get in a criminal hearing, but there is still some process. You get to present evidence, have witnesses, and kind of make your case. If you are detained, you're not let out on bond, you still have a hearing and you still have some due process, but you're doing it in a detained court. So you would be in detention that whole time. Obviously makes it harder to gather evidence, harder to see your family, harder to interact with your lawyer. But I used to do detained representation. Those people do get to present their case and you can win your case and then be allowed to stay in the United States. So again, what type of relief from deportation you get granted is going to be heavily dependent on your status and the specifics of your case. So it's not something that I can really talk about as to individuals, but the two basic options are either that you're granted relief. If you're granted relief, you're allowed to stay in the United States. If you're denied relief, you may be able to appeal, but ultimately you may be deported. So that's the basic procedure that someone would normally go through. And again, in the overwhelming majority of cases, if you are put into proceedings, that is what this will look like. Okay, but I do want to talk about a couple of specific things that have been happening, not frequently recently, but things that have been happening so you can be aware of how they may be different. So what are some variations from this norm that we've seen that can make things more complicated for people? One variation is that we have seen an uptake in people being transferred between different detention facilities. So it was always the case, and I remember this from when I was practicing, that sometimes you'd have someone, like I was in LA working, so you'd have someone who's detained in LA, and there's a few different facilities near LA, but instead of being sent to a facility in LA, either they'd be sent to Arizona initially, or they'd wind up there later, or sent somewhere else, Louisiana. That didn't happen often, but obviously it's a problem, right? Like if you have a lawyer in the Los Angeles area, your family's in the Los Angeles area, it's not easy to be trying to fight your case from a place like Louisiana where there are maybe fewer legal resources and you don't know anybody, right? So this is something that always happened. It's not a new thing, but there is statistical evidence that transfers have gone up in the new administration. So unfortunately, it is more likely that if you get detained by ICE, you will be sent somewhere out of state. Although again, that is not, to my understanding, happening to the majority of people in this area. What attorneys can do, if you're able to get an attorney and act quickly, is to file something called a habeas petition. It gets filed in a district court, so it's not an immigration court, it's in a federal district court before a judge. And they say, hey, we think ICE is going to transfer this person, and we don't want them transferred out of state, and we think it's illegal. So that is the way to contest a transfer if it's possible to do that with time. Again, not a situation most people will confront, but something that is possible. The second kind of variation that we've seen is increased use of something called expedited removal. So expedited removal, like we talked about, usually you have a hearing in immigration court, you get some procedural protections. Expedited removal is a process with fewer procedural protections. than you would have in an ordinary immigration hearing. This procedure is only supposed to apply to people who have entered the United States in the past 2 years and who did so without any kind of inspection. So like, let's say you came in on a visa and you had a valid visa at the time you came to the United States, and then your visa expired. So now you're technically undocumented. You don't have a status. You should not be put into expedited removal proceedings because you were inspected when you came in, you lawfully came in. You're not someone who entered without inspection. So this is really people who like came across the border is the most common situation, and they weren't inspected. They didn't see an immigration officer, or maybe they turned themselves into CBP, but they didn't have permission. And then they're put into expedited removal. So in a situation where you're put in expedited removal, the government, you don't have to see a judge, the government can deport you very quickly, okay? The only exception to that is if you say that you're afraid to return to your country and you pass a fear screening interview. So one thing to keep in mind if you're ever put in this situation is that it's important, if this is true for you, to express a fear of returning to the country that you're from so that you can try to trigger that procedural protection, okay? Anecdotally, in a few cases that I'm aware of, this is not common, there are people who have been put into expedited removal who do not fall into the category, okay? These are people who have been here for longer than 2 years. So they should not be in expedited removal by statute. But ICE has just said, you didn't supply evidence that you've been here for longer than 2 years, and so we're not going to fix this. We're going to put you through the expedited removal process. Obviously, that's very dangerous because you don't have a lot of process to protect you in that situation, right? So again, very unlikely to happen to anybody who is in this meeting, but something that can help in that situation is to carry evidence that you've been in the United States for more than 2 years, okay? This could be something like, you have the lease from your home and you keep it in your car, or you bought a home, you have that kind of proof that you own a house and you have a date of the contract, evidence that you've been working here, if you've been working legally. Again, not something that I expect you to have to worry about, but that would be the kind of thing that would be useful if you get into a situation somehow where ICE is considering putting you in this procedure. Again, this is a situation where if you have a lawyer and they can file a habeas petition, that is very important. Okay, so I said I would spend most of the time talking about just some basic safety tips, and I'm going to do that now. We'll talk about things like which documents should you have, which documents should you not have, what are your rights interacting with ICE in different settings, okay? So there are slightly different rules for each of these settings, and I'll talk about the ways that they're different quickly. Again, in most cases, if you do what we talk about here, like you'll be okay, right? Like if you are actually lawfully here, you haven't committed a crime, you have an interaction with ICE, and you kind of follow the steps that you need to follow, most people are not going to have a problem, right? But obviously some people will. ICE doesn't always have to follow legal rules. So we'll talk a little bit about how you might get in touch with a lawyer if you're in a situation where you need that. So what happens if ICE or other people who are working with immigration enforcement show up at your home? The Fourth Amendment protects you at home, and it does not matter if you are undocumented or what your immigration status is, okay? So government officials can only enter your home in 2 situations. They can enter if you give them permission, and we'll talk about what permission is, and they can enter if they have a court warrant that is signed by a judge, okay? This is a very important, so let's talk about the warrant quickly now. I'm showing you an image of 2 different documents. You may have heard of this before, but there is a thing called an administrative warrant. That's the thing on the right where it says ICE warrant. An administrative warrant is something that ICE creates within the agency. It is signed by an ICE officer, okay? It is not signed by a judge. A judge does not review it. The thing on the left is a court warrant, okay? This image is taken from an organization called ASAP that I'll actually talk a little bit about at the end. Look at the differences here, and you can also look this up online. You can ask to be shown the warrant if ICE officers or any other officers who you suspect may be involved with immigration, police, anyone come to your house, okay? If they show you something that looks like the warrant on the left, it says district court at the top, it lists your name, it actually has your name on it, it still has a valid date, it actually is signed by a judge, and you can see the word judge at the bottom where the signature is, that's a court warrant, okay? Then they have a right to access your home. If you're given something like the warrant on the right, where it says at the top, US Department of Homeland Security, okay? It's signed by an ICE officer. It names the Department of Homeland Security. It doesn't say the words district court anywhere. That is not a judicial warrant. That is an administrative warrant. It is something that ICE creates, and it does not give them a right to enter your home, okay? So you can always ask to see a warrant before you open the door to any law enforcement official. You can ask the official to slide the warrant under your door. You can ask them to show it to you through a window, okay? Do not open your door unless you already feel confident that you want to invite the officials into your home, because opening your door is considered consenting to a search, okay? So you need to get the warrant either shown to you or slipped under the door in some other way. You want to check that it comes from a court, it's signed by a judge, it lists you and your address, it's not generic, and it's not expired, okay? If the officials have a valid warrant from a judge, then you have to open the door. If they do not, then you can decide whether or not you open the door. Once you open the door, that counts as permission. So even if they didn't have a valid warrant, you open the door even a crack, then you count as giving them permission to come in, okay? And then they don't have to have other permission for the search. So that's why we say you check the warrant before you open the door. If officials enter without your permission, you'll want to try to get their badge numbers, and you'll want to say that you didn't consent to the search, okay? There's a similar situation at work in terms of what the government needs to enter the premises, but you obviously may not be the one making the decision, right? Like at home, you know, you're with your loved ones, your home is your castle, but at work, it's going to be obviously dependent on how your employer and coworkers think about things. If you feel comfortable, you may be able to have a conversation with them about how you'd handle a situation like this. Even if ICE agents come to your workplace and are in your workplace, there are still a few rights you have, okay? You don't have to answer questions. You can remain silent. There's a Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. Again, it applies to everybody regardless of their immigration status. You don't have to share where you were born. You don't have to share information about your immigration status. In fact, if you do that, it can be used as evidence against you in a deportation proceeding. You can refuse a search if they ask to search you. Just as a couple of tips, it is not a good idea if you have identity documents from a foreign country to provide those identity documents. I know a lot of people carry those documents around with them, and there may be reasons to do that. Like if you actually are detained by ICE, it's better to have those documents than not. But if you're interacting with an ICE officer or police or any other officer who you suspect may be, involved with immigration enforcement, if you give them documents from a foreign country, that is evidence that they can use to potentially show that you don't belong in the United States, particularly if you're undocumented. But even if you have status, they may take that as a proof that you're actually not meant to be here. So be very careful about that. And finally, it is important to stay calm, because you don't want to give the government reasons to think, hey, this person seems suspicious. If you can kind of just stay calm, don't run, and keep quiet, that's the best way to deal with things if possible, although I understand that that's difficult. Okay, again, interacting with ICE on the street. So all these situations are slightly different. The rules that apply are slightly different, but you do have some protections in all of these situations. So again, neither ICE nor the police can arrest you unless they have evidence either that you committed a crime or that you're not authorized to be in the United States, okay? So it's not quite the same level of protection that you have in your home, but you do have some protections and some rights. If an ICE officer asks you questions, including where were you born, where do you live, what country are you a citizen of, you do not have to answer those questions. And your answers can be used as evidence against you. So you have a choice to remain silent, to say that you don't want to answer. In the states in our region, you also have a choice about whether to answer questions from the police. Now, that's not to say that they may not get frustrated at you if you don't answer questions, but legally you have a right to not answer questions from the police. Again, it is not a good idea to provide ICE with foreign identification or fake documents. So again, like a lot of people carry their documents around and have started doing that because of what's happening with immigration enforcement. It is not a good idea in a lot of situations to show foreign documents because of what we've talked about those being evidence. So something that a lot of people do that you may want to reconsider or at least not volunteer to ICE if you get in a situation where you're interacting with ICE or any other official who may be involved with immigration enforcement. If you are having an interaction with an officer, you can ask them if you're being arrested or detained. If they say no, then you can ask if you can leave. And if they say, yes, you can leave, you can walk away. Just do it slowly, not in a way where you seem like you're fleeing or like you might be a danger, but just walk away. If the officer just says, yes, you are being arrested or detained, you can ask to speak with a lawyer. And again, I'll say this over and over again, you have a Fifth Amendment right to remain silent and not answer questions. Okay, finally, driving. And hopefully this will all be shared later. I'm happy to provide the PowerPoint if it's helpful. But again, ICE cannot search your car unless they have a warrant, they have your permission, or they have evidence that you committed a crime. Now, there are obviously examples where ICE does things that are not legal, right? So I don't know if folks saw, but there was a video recently of a woman in Maryland who ICE broke the window on her car to try to get her out of the car. She did roll down her window a bit, so that was not necessarily something that I would advise doing. ICE doesn't always follow these rules. If they don't follow the rules, you may have a better chance getting out with a habeas petition if you file one. But again, most people are still going to follow the rules. Okay, so that's why we tell you this, because in most situations, this is going to help protect you. So what is some advice about these interactions if you're in your car? Stay in the car. Don't open your window. Don't roll down the window. Just stay put, stay where you are. If you can talk to them through the window, that's best. Okay, if you're able to do that without opening the window. You want to have your hands on the steering wheel, visible, so that there's no question you're not doing anything you're not supposed to be. If you need to get ID, you can say to them, I'm going to get my ID, but you have your hands visible. Again, if you're asked questions about your immigration status or anything that could reveal what your immigration status is or that you have foreign birth, you do not have to answer them. If the officer asks for your driver's license, you may have to roll down the window to give them that. Okay. Again, documents issued by a foreign country, if you can avoid it, if you have a US driver's license, better to provide that and not provide any foreign documents. And passengers do not legally have to provide ID. Okay. We can talk about this if people have questions in the Q&A, but again, most people in most situations, that is going to be the best advice for keeping yourself safe and avoiding a problem. So very quickly, and again, I'll talk a little bit about legal resources when we do the Q&A, just so you understand if you're detained and put into deportation proceedings, what would happen. So your options for contesting deportation are heavily dependent on your immigration status and the grounds that the government has to try to remove you from the United States. So undocumented people, and I said this earlier, undocumented people can sometimes stay in the United States, but they're going to have different options for trying to contest deportation than someone who has a visa, who has asylum, who has a green card, who has, even potentially another kind of status. There are going to be different options. And the reasons that the government says that they have to deport you are going to be different, right? So again, we'll talk a little bit about legal representation. There is a bit of a crisis of legal representation right now because there is so much need, but we can talk about some options for finding a lawyer. Also, private lawyers can be good depending on whether you have a referral from somebody. So it's not a bad idea if you're worried about this to just know what lawyer would I contact if I had an issue with this and have a couple of names maybe even do a consult, but like you don't have to, just like have like kind of like a set of people you might reach out to if you had a problem. Detention, we talked about this a little bit, but if you're detained, like you get put in proceedings, there are also some options to try to get out of detention. So we talked about bond hearings. Most people are going to be entitled to a bond hearing, not all of them, but you can try to get a bond hearing for an immigration judge. And then we also talked a little bit about habeas, which is going not to the immigration court, but to the federal district court and saying to the judge, my detention is wrongful, or, I shouldn't be transferred, right? So again, a lawyer is going to be helpful, particularly with habeas, where it's like a complex procedure. And we can talk a little bit about how you might go about identifying a lawyer, but keeping in mind that there is a dearth of legal resources right now. So that's it for the presentation part of the presentation. I did want to leave time for questions, but hopefully that's helpful. And I look forward to hearing what all you would like additional information about. And I will provide some tips about legal resources and other organizations you might want to get in touch with when we do the Q&A and are not recording.
Thank you so much for this valuable information, Emily. You've given us some practical information for individuals and families, and as well as for allies in the community. Before we open it up to questions, can you share information about the Immigrant Experience Project you and your colleagues at Georgetown Law are conducting for those who live in the greater Washington, D.C. area?
Yes, thank you. So as Brandy says, I run something called the Immigrant Experience Project. So my background is as an immigration attorney. It's as a defense attorney. Now I do research with immigrant communities about their experiences with immigration enforcement. And I think that if you're on this call right now, maybe this like feels really intuitive to you. You probably have some sense of this. We're going through a huge transformation in the United States in terms of how the government is relating to immigrant communities, right? There's a lot more scrutiny of immigrants. There's a lot more enforcement, and there's a lot more fear in immigrant communities than there has been any time in the recent past. So the goal of this project is really just to document and try to understand how this change is affecting immigrants and their loved ones and their communities. You can think of it almost as like a human rights project. We just want to be able to kind of like record what's happening to people and how they experience it. So if you're potentially interested in talking to us, I'll just say a little bit about the study. So we are talking really broadly to people with any immigrant status. This includes green card holders. It includes people with visas, folks who have asylum, folks who have SIV, DACA. Everyone's experiences are relevant and valid, and only you can tell the story of what it means to be an immigrant in the United States at this moment in our history where things are changing so much. We have a very detailed privacy protocol. I can say more about this, and I'll share information about how to contact us as well as how to contact me. But basically, we don't save any identifying information on participants. You be totally anonymous in any reports or publications that we do. It's a very cautious system. I was talking to someone from a law firm the other day, and it was like more cautious than what their law firm does to protect data. So we're very concerned about data privacy. We have a bunch of different languages available on the study team, so we can interview you in a language you're comfortable in. We do use interpreters in cases where people aren't comfortable in one of the languages we speak. So if you're not a Spanish, French, Arabic, Hindi speaker, we can bring in an interpreter to work with you so that you're comfortable. So anyway, if you're interested in potentially participating, there's a few ways to get in touch with us. And we can share these also after the presentation. So there's a study phone number. Only the research assistants for this project and I have access to that number. You can call us, text us, send us a message on WhatsApp or Signal. We also have an email address. And finally, I am happy to talk directly to anybody who's interested in participating in the project. So afterward, I'm recording, I'll share my number. You're welcome to get in touch. I will say I'm 37 weeks pregnant right now. So at some point I will go off on my maternity leave. But I'm happy to talk in the next couple of weeks while I'm still around. And after that, the RAs on the project are great. I have hand selected and trained all of them. They all have a connection to immigrant communities, and they're the ones who would be working with you.
Thank you. And for those in the audience, we will share the flyers and in the multiple languages, sharing details about how participants can get in touch with with Emily and her team for the study when the recording is available and shared later this week. If you are not subscribed yet to receive Their Stories, Our Stories email, you can do so. I dropped a link in the chat there to subscribe for those emails. If you or someone you know would be interested in participating or interested in this recording, please feel free to share that and the flyers with folks. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll stop the recording now to answer audience questions.